Um, so this week we're going to look at this theme of God as warrior. I picked this one first because we finish up Genesis and we get into Exodus, and the very first thing that happens is the story of the people crying out and God acting on their behalf. But I am going to skip over the plagues and the interaction in Egypt for this week. And I want to look at the first example, the first time that God is referred to as a warrior, as someone who is battling on behalf of the people of Israel. And so we're going to start with chapter 15 of Exodus today. But before we get into the actual text, I wanted to just throw out some kind of preliminary thoughts that were percolating with me and some of the things that I read about this. So this stuff with the warrior God is a major part of why we talked about this at the beginning. That guy Marcion, in the early days of Christianity, as they were trying to figure out, who Jesus is and how he connects to God. And Marcion said, well, the God of the Old Testament cannot be the same God as the God that Jesus brought to us, because Jesus brings peace, Jesus brings justice, Jesus brings restoration. And this God in the Old Testament is a warrior. This God is out for vengeance and bloodshed and is volatile and angry and wrathful. And so this is not the same God. And so Marcion didn't get rid of the entire Old Testament, but got rid of a lot of it because he thought that it wasn't a faithful representation of who the God of Jesus Christ was. So that's a possibility for us. Not a great possibility, because Marcion was declared a heretic, and we don't necessarily want to be declared heretics. Although sometimes it's fun to play with that. So another option could be that we could distinguish, we could separate the way that the Bible describes God from our understanding of who God actually is. So there's this concept that God is who God is, and the Bible is a feeble attempt to describe God, but that those descriptions are so flawed, they are so mired in their context and the desires of the humans who wrote down those stories and those ideas, that you can't possibly understand something about God through the scriptures. Now, that seems like a little excessive. Probably, once again, we'd be rejecting most of the text. But I think that the difficulty with that is who gets to decide what descriptions are faithful to who God really is, and who gets to decide which descriptions are not faithful to who God really is. We know of God through Jesus as the Word of God and as the incarnated God, but outside of that, how do we put these different stories, these different concepts of who God is into the, yes, this is really God, or no, this is a bad description and does not actually describe God. That's challenging, because we don't know, we don't know who would get to do that, which human or set of humans would get to be the ones to make that decision. But, that said, I think we do take that tack a lot more often than we think we do. We often do it with, especially the law and other types of readings that are challenging to us, and we do it without really even thinking about it. Nobody is going to accuse me of not being a good Christian because I haven't yet sold my daughter into slavery. If you know anybody who has been married and divorced and remarried, nobody is stoning them to death. And so we make these decisions about what is and is not binding in the law. We make these decisions about what God does and does not require of us. based on perhaps, our reading of Jesus and deep theological discussion and thought, or perhaps just because we don't like it and we don't want it to be true. And so we ignore it, we reject it. Whether you are the, most politically and theologically conservative Christian there is, or if you are, way out there in the liberal liberation theology group, everybody does it. It just change depending on your perspective. You reject or accept different passages as binding or not binding. So that's a possibility, and we are kind of doing it a little bit already, but I would suggest that rejecting anything that indicates that God might be violent is not the best possibility. And I think it's because there are actually some things that we can gain from reading these passages, reading from the perspective that God is, God really is speaking to us through this. I think, when we read with a little bit of that grain of salt about the text itself, we, acknowledge that all figurative language has limits. So anything that we say about God is a metaphor. We can't describe God without using comparisons, without trying to connect this unknown to something that we know. But of course, there are always limits to that. So when we say, for example, that, God is our Father, there are some people who are really offended by that and try not to say it. I certainly try not to use he language as often as I can when I'm speaking and reading and writing, because that does give the wrong impression that God is male. But I think that there is value in, especially if you had a positive relationship with your father and had a good father, to make those kinds of connections. And I don't think there's anything wrong with adding in other metaphors to remind us that even if we use conflicting metaphors, all of them are true at the same time to the same degree, and all of them are false at the same time to the same degree. So God is our father, God is our mother, God is our brother, God is our sister, God is our next door neighbor. All of these things can be true and untrue at the same time. Also, when we read some of these passages that are about God as warrior and this violence, there is theological merit and benefit to trying to dig into some of these and understand exactly what it is that's trying to say. What is it that God is really doing here? Never is God just randomly acting in violence and throwing people under the bus or destroying things just for the sake of destroying things. There's a purpose for it. So if we kind of dig into it and read, we can try to understand a little bit about that. But there are dangers to reading, reading in these ways. If we decide that we're going to kind of walk that fine line between understanding scripture as majorly flawed and of no value versus understanding scripture as completely true and accurate, how do we know anything about God for sure? How can we know what we think isn't our own desire for who God is? So how can we know when we're looking at something and trying to determine how accurate it is about God, that it isn't what we want God to be rather than who God really is? And that's not really a question that we can answer, but something that we have to keep in mind. And then we certainly don't want to make our way into Marcion's heresy, at least I don't think so, and reject the scripture outright in favor of just sticking with the scriptures about Christ, because the scriptures of Christ, the Hebrew scriptures that he used, forms the foundation for understanding who Christ is. So without those, I think we're missing a major important piece of the puzzle. So I think that is all of my introductory thoughts. So I've got a list of some passages here for us to take a look at today. And today I do have some ideas and kind of some insights written down, but I want to let all of you lead the conversation, bring up the things that are of interest and importance to you. And as we're reading these, just to think, kind of focusing on that violence thing. So asking the question, what is the violence that's being done in this passage? Who is doing it and why are some questions that we can kind of focus on, but certainly other things as they pique your interest related to this topic of violence is just fine. So let's jump into Exodus chapter 15. And we are going to look at verses 1 through 18. So if we've got a volunteer reader for that one, that would be great.
I can read 1 to 11 if somebody else wants to finish. Okay, I'm going for it.
All right.
Then Moses and the Israelites sang the song to the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him. My father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has hurled into the sea. The best of Pharaoh's officers are drowned in the Red Sea. The deep waters have covered them. They sank to the depths like a stone. Your right hand, Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, Lord, shattered the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you threw down those who opposed you. You unleashed your burning anger. It consumed them like stubble. By the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The surging waters stood up like a wall. The deep waters congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy boasted, I will pursue, I will overtake them. I will divide the spoils. I will gorge myself on them. I will draw my sword and my hand will destroy them. But you blew with your breath, and the sea covered them. They sank like lead to the mighty waters. Who among the gods are like you, Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders? You stretch out your right hand, and the earth swallows your enemies. In your unfailing love, you will lead the people you have redeemed. In your strength, you will guide them to your holy dwelling. The nations will hear and tremble. Anguish will grip the people of Philistia. The chiefs of Edom will be terrified. The leaders of Moab will be seized with trembling. The people of Canaan will melt away. Terror and dread will fall on them. By the power of your arm, they will be as still as stone. And your people pass by, Lord, until the people you brought pass by. You will bring them in and plant them on the mountain of your inheritance, the place, Lord, you made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, Lord, your hands established. How far do you want me to read?
18.
Okay, got one more to go. The Lord reigns forever and ever.
All right.
Okay, I'm going to go get my coffee. I'll be back.
Okay.
That's what was in the microwave.
I'm in the middle of Bible study.
Letting everybody kind of take a look.
When we're done,
What is of interest to you? What is challenging? What do you see in terms of violence?
Violence by God or violence by the Egyptians? Because there's a lot of violence by Egyptians in this.
Yep, either way. Who is doing the violence and why?
Well, the Egyptians were going to do the violence to rid them of what they considered their enemy and take their goods and divide the spoils and destroy them.
Okay.
Meaning God took it the other direction and drowned them.
Mm.
I keep thinking about Pharaoh. He changed his mind after he said they could go, but he was going to destroy them all. He wasn't thinking straight. If he destroyed them all, he had no workers left.
This
So
is true.
he didn't think globally, like if I get rid of all my slaves and stuff, who's going to do the building and the farming and everything?
So that is an interesting point. So we've got this Pharaoh figure, and it's pretty well established these days that we're not supposed to try to figure out which Pharaoh this is, because the point isn't that this was a historical event with a particular Pharaoh. The point is that Pharaoh, with a capital P, represents the evil of humanity, represents the chaos that God is opposed to. Is not necessarily a particular individual, but is a motif for that which opposes God. And so that which opposes God, Pharaoh, is acting in anger and wrath and frustration and vengeance, and not thinking about the economy that is going to be destroyed if he kills all of his slaves, not thinking about the impact of his decision making in terms of we'll get back to this another week, but the 10 all those plagues that come in and destroy all the crops and his people. He's not a leader. He's not acting on behalf of his people. He is acting on his own behalf, and just as he's just being petulant almost in the story. So contrast that to the God of order, to the God who created everything out of chaos, to the God who opposes chaos. So in that way, Pharaoh kind of represents the anti-creator. He is unable to control the creation, to manipulate the creation toward his will in the way that the creator does. And so he responds to that frustration, to that inability, with violence, with stepping out of his place in the created order, with wanting to take away that which belongs to someone else, that which belongs to God, really, the lives of the Israelites, the possessions of the Israelites, and the decisions over life and death that are rightfully God's. What other thoughts?
You could look at it this way. I keep thinking of the 10 Commandments and the wall of water as they're walking across. They're on the other side. And so here Pharaoh is in the middle of the thing, and God just stopped blowing on the water. And what's the water going to do? It's just going to go back to where it came from. So God let the water do his job.
So it's not directly God acting against them. It's God. It's the creation itself, really, using its own natural instincts, its own natural order to reestablish order, to get rid of that which is threatening it. Interesting. I find it interesting too, where it describes that moment. It doesn't, we focus on the drowning, we focus on the death of Pharaoh and his army and their horses and everything. But the description doesn't really go in that direction. The description is more about the water and about the weight of it. It says, he cast Pharaoh's army and Pharaoh's chariots and his army, he cast into the sea. His picked officers were sunk in the Red Sea. The floods covered them. They went down into the depths like a stone. And so it's about the weight of them rather than necessarily about their deaths, about their drowning. And that kind of this kind of reminds me with all this water of, again, that creation, that chaos, that it's the chaos itself that is consuming them because of perhaps the weight of their sin, the weight of their violence. Pam, did you have something?
I have a question of clarification. In my Bible, it says, just clarify. It says Pharaoh's chariots and army he dumped in the sea. So that's God who dumped, not the Pharaoh who dumped. Just clarifying.
Yeah, it doesn't say. It's just he.
He dumped, and it's not capitalized, so, which is a modern construct, but yeah. So the Pharaoh didn't dump, God obviously dumped everybody, right?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, you're right. In the Hebrew, there isn't even a word for he when it comes to verbs. The way that the verb is conjugated tells you the subject. And so it would have just said cast into the sea, and then because of the way that the word cast is written, you can figure out that it's the subject of that sentence is he, but it doesn't say who he is.
I
So,
think the meaning is, I just needed to clarify it, so I think that's
in
what
the
it
very
said.
next line, his picked officers were sunk in the Red Sea. His picked officers are not God's picked officers, they are Pharaoh's. So
Did Pharaoh actually die? I thought the way I read it is he sent out the best of everything. He didn't personally go with them. It doesn't say in my Bible, it doesn't say that Pharaoh and his chariots and his army and the best of his, it just says the chariots, his army, and the best of his officers.
So in the chapter previous, in chapter 14, let's see, it says, the Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers.
But it doesn't say Pharaoh actually.
No, it
Would
doesn't.
the Pharaoh have actually led his armies? I don't think so.
Well, chapter verse 19 doesn't mention him directly. It just says horses, chariots, and horsemen.
Yeah.
And in the movie, Pharaoh was on the rock, all upset. It had to be a literal interpretation of the Bible for them to make a movie about it.
This is true. Charlton Heston is known for his accuracy.
I think it was Charlton, wasn't it? Who made the film? Was it
Cecil B. DeMille.
Cecil B. DeMille. It was Yul Brynner was the one on the rock.
Yeah.
Yes.
His last.
I don't know if it was Pharaoh who, if it was Pharaoh was with them, and it's possible, Pam, you're right, that we could be reading this. Pharaoh cast his own armies into the sea, and his picked officers were sunk because the floods covered them. They went down into the depths like a stone.
It's good for the movie.
I could see the chariots and all the all the armor and stuff would take them to the bottom of the sea.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah. And the armor on the horses, because they used to put armor on the horses as well.
It could also be a timing thing. Pharaoh could have directed them to go after the Israelites, and the water, they had to go into the water, like they had to obey the order to go into the water, whether the water was there or not. I know it says that they got out in the middle and then the water came back, but it could be a timing thing too,
Mm.
that they just he just directed them into the water.
Hmm.
Oh, Sin.
But God also provided that flame of fire that kept all Pharaoh's army and stuff away from the Israelites until they got safely across. So,
Yeah.
Mhm.
So we see kind of passive violence perhaps from God here. So do any of you listen to Pastor Bob's daily devotions? I won't tell if you say no.
I
I
don't.
don't. I don't.
I do.
Karen, you do?
Yeah.
So
do.
he's talking this week. I don't remember which day. Maybe it's tomorrow, but he's talking about this passage as well, and he makes the point, or at some point made the point, that there are ancient commentaries called the Midrash that were Jewish scholars and thinkers who kind of read these things and asked these questions and then debated with each other about the answers. And there's a famous commentary on this particular passage that combines this passage with Isaiah chapter 19, verse 22. And that says, "The Lord will strike Egypt, striking and healing. They will return to the Lord, and he will listen to their supplications and heal them." And so this particular commentator says that God actually rebuked the Israelites for singing and cheering because the Egyptians are God's children too, and the fact that they are dead is not something to be cheered, not something to be celebrated. Egypt belongs to God as well. So that's kind of an interesting interpretation. Any other thoughts or comments on this one?
No.
All right, then let's move on to, we're going to look at Psalm 24 next. Psalm 24.
That's a big jump.
Yes.
This last time, the pages are so thin, I turned to Leviticus 15. That is really different. So while Judy's reading and I'm reading along, I'm thinking, this isn't the same interpretation. Ah. Okay, 24?
Yes, Psalm 24. So this
I don't
one's
know
not
how they
too
make this.
long.
Okay.
Judy's off the hook for the rest of the day because she did her long reading. So who'd like to do this one?
I'll read it.
All
How
right,
far?
great. Thank you, Pam.
How far?
Whole
The whole
thing.
thing. Okay. God claims earth and everything in it. God claims world and all who live on it. He built it on ocean foundations, laid it out on river girders. Who can climb Mount God? Who can scale the holy north face? Only the clean-handed, only the pure-hearted, men who won't cheat, women who won't seduce. God is at their side. With God's help, they make it. This, Jacob, is what happens to God seekers, God questers. Wake up, you sleepyhead city. Wake up, you sleepyhead people. King Glory is ready to enter. Who is this King Glory? God, armed and battle ready. Wake up, you sleepyhead city. Wake up, you sleepyhead people. King Glory is ready to enter. Who is this King Glory? God of the angel armies, he is King Glory.
All right. So here we've got not just just the statement, the Lord is a warrior like we did last time, but kind of a description of God as that warrior in more detail.
actually, there's a contemporary worship song
Yes.
that is this psalm. Don't ask me what the title is, but
King of
it's-
Glory.
yes.
Yeah. Bill sings it sometimes in worship.
I think the words are different than what
Yes.
I have here. Yeah.
Songwriters can sometimes move things around.
Hey, Katie, can you answer something for me?
Sure. Well, I can
And-
try.
In my version of the Bible, in verse 6 and at verse, what is it, 10, at the end, it says Selah, Selah. It's kind of like off to the side.
Mhm.
And I'm like, what is that?
So that is that is the instructions for when you are singing this. If you're
Okay.
if you're singing, using it as a song, as a psalm, then it's kind of the musical directions, possibly
Okay.
referring to a refrain or kind of the end of a verse. So it doesn't.
Okay,
It's not. It
thanks,
doesn't
'cause I'm
have
not-
any
It just,
meaning for when we're just reading it.
all right.
It's
Well,
kind of like
thank
when we have lyrics and it says, here's the verse, and then it has in parentheses refrain, so that it doesn't have to reprint.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I'm like,
No problem.
I don't know what that means. And I started flipping around and I saw a couple of other ones and I'm like, okay, no clue.
So possibly like mine is divided up into 3 sections. There are 4 lines at the top, verses 1 and 2, and then it starts with 3 through 6, and then it's got the Selah, and then 7 through 10, and then Selah. So it's possible that you would sing the first 2 verses, and then you would sing the first verse, and then you would go back to kind of that refrain of the first 2 verses, and then go down to verse 7 and finish it, and then go back and sing again. Those
Okay.
first 2 verses, something like that could have been the model, the frame for it.
Thank you for the education of the Bible illiterate.
That's okay.
I was like, that's really weird. Why is that there?
Yeah. So in terms of the contents with this, we've got this: the Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads that the King of Glory may come in. The Lord of hosts. All these images of battle. So this one isn't necessarily as challenging as some of the other ones, because it's just kind of describing God in that battle armor, not necessarily acting as a warrior, but just looking like a warrior. But I really like that this psalm kind of puts God as a warrior in the context of asking questions about God's sovereignty. So in verse 3, who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? Who shall stand in this holy place? Who is the King of Glory? It's the Lord. And so kind of comparing God to any other power on earth. The earth belongs to the Lord because God founded it. God created it. So that kind of reminder of the order of the creation, kind of bringing us back to our working definition of violence, that violence is anything that attempts to break out of the good order that God has created, attempts to overcome God's authority and take it for oneself. What else? We also have that connection again, God's warrior-like image here refers not just generally to being a warrior, to battling, to killing and maiming and doing all those terrible things related to war, but again, it's related to justice, to righteousness. Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in his holy place? those who have clean hands and pure hearts, who do not lift up their souls to what is false and do not swear deceitfully. They will receive the blessing of the Lord and vindication from the God of their salvation. So it's a reminder that God's behavior is about blessing all of creation. It's about judging and restoring that which has been broken, so that, you know, what's at stake is not God's ego. What's at stake is not God's desire to just control everything and be in charge. What's at stake is the welfare of God's people. And the people of God are described as those who acknowledge God, those who understand who God is and their position in relationship to God. Those people who live up to the community that God intends for them, and the promise that God will defend them, will defend those who live in this way, live against the violence and oppression of the world by upholding and defending God's order, God's way of doing things. So kind of reminding us of the why for God, because God's why is different than our why. God's why for seeming to be a warrior, to being involved in battle, is different than any other nation and their purpose for engaging in battle.
I also was thinking when we were reading about them going through the parting the Red Sea, that God was trying to show them to trust him, you know. Again and again and again, he tries to drive home the idea that they need to trust him, and they never do.
Yeah.
And so then he has to show them with some big production, some big thing that's going to get their attention. And I think that's still today, it's like, how deeply do we trust that God is going to take care of us? I don't know. That's just the thought that came to my mind.
No, yeah, and that makes sense. I mean, that's kind of, we were criticizing Abraham last week, that God said, I'm going to do all these things for you. Don't worry, I'm here with you. Everything's going to be fine. You can trust me. And then the very first thing that Abraham does is not trust God and decide that he's going to take matters into his own hands because he's afraid of the violence that could overwhelm him, and does a terrible job of it. Doesn't come up with a very good plan, that's for sure. Anything else on this one before we move on? All right, then let's move to another psalm. We're going to look at Psalm 46.
Marcella.
Do you want me to read it?
Sure, that'd be great, Karen.
God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble with its tumult. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of the city, it shall not be moved. God will help it when the morning dawns. The nations are in an uproar, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us, the God of Jacob is our refuge. Come behold the works of the Lord. See what desolations he has brought on the earth. He makes wars cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I am exalted among the nations. I am exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge.
All right. Thank you, Karen.
Can I ask a question? This totally shows how ignorant I am. But why is God called Jacob Wrestling? Jacob Wrestling God. It's hyphenated more than once.
Where is this?
It's in my version. Like
Oh, the God of Jacob. The God of
yeah.
Jacob.
So it's
The
Jacob Wrestling God.
is our refuge.
Because, yeah.
So that's a reference to the story of Jacob wrestling with it's in the story it's a messenger from God who comes and wrestles with him all night, and in the morning he releases him and gives him a new name, Israel. And Israel refers to this. Israel is about the name Israel means to wrestle, to struggle, to kind of to juggle with ideas, and so the very name of the people of God is those who wrestle, those who consider, those who continue to ponder over the meaning of these things, and not just in an intellectual way, but perhaps in a physical way, wrestling against the way that the world lives to be different than the world is. So when we talk about God as the one who wrestled with Jacob, we're talking about the establishment of the people of God and the reminder that as the people of God, our very identity is wrapped up in this in this wrestling, in this constant attempt to understand more, to be in that relationship with God where we are working toward becoming those people that God calls us to be. All those kinds of images are wrapped up in that.
That's a pretty big hyphen.
Yeah, it is. I like that though. That the most of the translations say God of Jacob, which it could bring up that story, but yours it makes it very explicit.
So in this, Katie, it says in 9, he makes war cease, but then it talks about how he does it by basically breaking and destroying the weapons.
Yeah, so he takes all the materials of war and destroys them. I think it's in Isaiah where it talks about pounding spears into plowshares, kind of retooling, reusing those things because they're not needed anymore. I think that passage is really interesting because it talks about, mine says, "Come, behold the works of the Lord, see what desolations he has brought on the earth." And what are those desolations? He makes wars cease. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. So I think that that word desolations is being used ironically, perhaps in a way. That is God someone to be feared? Is God a God of wrath and terror? Oh yes, see what desolations God brings upon the earth. God is so wrathful and scary that he makes wars to cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. God is not the kind of God who's going to come in and destroy you. God's the kind of God who's going to come in and establish peace. And not just, the kind of peace that nations bring, the kinds of peace where somebody's in control and the other people have to shut up and deal with it, but real peace, the kind of peace that only God can bring, making peace the norm for all the earth rather than just a momentary lull in the action until some new nation with more power comes into town. And we get that, with the nations are in an uproar and the kingdoms totter. So kind of referring to, this is obviously a psalm of thanksgiving, a psalm reminding us that God is our protector. God is there for us. God will, God has the strength and the ability to defend us. And so we need not fear. And there are two things here that are referred to as things that could be, that we should and could fear without God. It talks about the earth. The earth should change, the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, the waters and roar and foam, the mountains tremble with its tumult. This is referring to things that we fear that are related to, forces of creation, and especially at this time, unknown, understood, misunderstood, not understood, earth events, earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, these kinds of things. Not that some of that stuff exists there, but for us, that would be the case. Kind of the lack of control over creation, the power of death that we have no control over. And then also our fear of the nations that are in an uproar, kingdoms tottering. So political unrest, war, instability, economic unrest, social unrest, all of the kinds of things that even we're experiencing today are being described here as things that threaten the lives of God's people. And so if we take Pam's version, which I really like, we are reminded that it's our job to wrestle with those things. It's our job to be kind of the go-between and to try to interpret what's happening in our world from the perspective of God's desire for that world, and to wrestle with how we can help to bring about that change. But this psalm also provides us with comfort. It reminds us that God is in control, even though from our perspective it looks really bad. Things are violent. The world itself is sometimes turned against us with pandemics and earthquakes and hurricanes and these, whatever that big thing was that happened in Iowa that I'd never heard of before. All these things are terrifying to us, but God's got it under control, and God is, we can rely on God to bring us comfort and strength and act as our refuge. Oh, I made a little note about the verse 10. Be still and know that I am God. So the word that's translated as be still also means stop, let it drop, cease and desist. So kind of what it's saying is stop depending on all these other things to save you. Stop putting your trust in the nations and their ability to war against each other and their earthly power. Stop using destruction and violence to make yourself feel stable and secure and protected. There is only one God, and I don't destroy or hurt. I fight for peace. And so that is what you are called to do as well, even though it is a harder choice to make. It's the right choice to make. Other ideas or questions on this one?
That's one of my mantras, because when it seems like when you're in the midst of chaos or a problem, or at least for me, if I can just take a step back and say, be still and know that I am God, it just comes in my head. It straightens everything out for me. It smooths everything out for me. It's like, oh yeah, I just need to be still and let God deal with it. It's his time. It's his way. And I don't know. It comes in my head all the time.
Yeah, I think that's
Feels
good.
like life is so chaotic, you know.
Yeah. That reminder that, I am God and you are not. And so you don't
Mhm.
have to be the one to rescue every single moment. You don't have to be the one to save the day.
Right,
You don't have to be the one to
Right.
know what to do in every situation.
right.
And if I'm trying to do that is violence, right? According to our definition, you're doing violence
Oh,
to
yeah.
yourself by trying to do everything, or by trying to take over, by trying to have, trying to feel all of that pressure and stress and not letting God take care of it. You are doing violence to yourself. You're doing violence to the people you're trying to help in some ways, because you're taking on too much.
Oh, that's a good thing for me to hear today. That's a good thing. Yeah.
Me too, most days.
I'll have to remember that.
Maybe we should needlepoint it.
Yeah, make a pillow. All right, should we move on to our sort of last, I guess, second to last passage here? We're going to move to Isaiah 63.
I'll be able to find that.
Thank you for putting these in order.
Is it 63?
63, yes.
Is Isaiah the longest book in the Bible? Has the most chapters?
Psalms
Okay.
150.
David was certainly prolific.
Yes.
You wondered when he had time to rule the kingdom if he was writing all these psalms.
And
He
having all
wrote
these
'em.
children.
He's writing in the cave. I didn't know.
They lived longer back then, you know?
Oh, yeah. You really want to be 970 years old?
No, I do not. All right, Steve, are you up for verses
Yeah.
1 through 6 here?
Just 1 through 6?
Yep.
That's easy stuff. I thought you were going to ask me to go through the whole thing. All right, 63, 1 through 6. Here we go. Who is this coming from Edom, from Bozrah, with his garments stained crimson? Who is this robed in splendor, striding forward in the greatness of his strength? It is I, speaking in righteousness, mighty to save. Why are your garments red, like those of one treading the winepress? I have trodden the winepress alone. From the nations, no one was with me. I trampled them in my anger and trod them down in my wrath. Their blood splattered my garments, and I stained on my clothing. For the day of vengeance was in my heart, and the year of my redemption has come. I looked, but there was no one to help. I was appalled that no one gave support. So my own arm worked salvation for me, and my wrath sustained me. I trampled the nations in my anger. I made my wrath, I made them drunk and poured their blood on the ground. That's
That was cheery.
yeah, that was pretty aggressive. Yeah, that's not wine. That's blood.
So who did that?
That's a really good question.
My
Who's I?
Bible says it's God's day of vengeance and redemption, but it doesn't say who the person is.
Hmm.
It just says God's day of vengeance.
Almost seems like some Bible quote that some psychopath would use to justify whatever he does.
It's true.
Oops, in the Bible.
So this passage is supposed to be from the perspective of the watchtower person, the person who, in the city behind the gates is keeping an eye out around the city for anybody approaching. And so that person
Right.
is the one that speaks at the beginning. Who is this coming with garments stained crimson, marching in great might? And then the response is from the person who's coming. It is I, announcing vindication, mighty to save. And then the person asks, why are your robes red, like those who tread the winepress? And then the answer is all the whole rest of the passage. I have trodden alone, blah, 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 all the nasty stuff.
Okay. Yeah, just the heading on mine says God's Day of Vengeance and Redemption. Okay.
But whomever this is acted alone. They said there was no one to help me.
Mm-hmm.
He was appalled, but he went ahead and did it on his own. So, and he was angry enough that he could do it. His wrath sustained him. I don't know if it was, I'm assuming it's a him, not a her.
Wrath sustaining is an interesting concept. Yeah, considering
Yeah.
what happened. So,
He was angry enough to keep it up till everything was done.
So obviously this is not one where we can, kind of sweep the violence part under the rug. But I think it's important that we see why, what is the problem here? Why is God feeling this wrathful? And in verse 4, my version says, the year for my redeeming work had come. And the word redemption, we kind of use it theologically now in terms of redeeming us and saving us from our sins and those kinds of things. But at this time, the word redemption, redeem, was used in relationship to buying someone from slavery, buying a relative or loved one out of slavery, or perhaps purchasing the property of a deceased person so that you can ensure that the property continues to remain prosperous in terms of the vineyards or whatever it is that's going on there. And so redeeming something is acting on behalf of someone who is powerless and helpless to act. You are, buying someone out of slavery. They have no ability to remove themselves from that situation. You are redeeming the property of someone who has died, making sure that it continues to prosper and the work that they have put into it is not lost. And so we're kind of back again to focusing on justice. We get, mention of righteousness, rescuing, restoring order, reestablishing the goodness of creation, kind of undoing the chaos, undoing the violence that has been done against all of creation by the humans. We talk about, at the beginning, it talks about coming from Edom. So is this God expressing some kind of, wrath against this particular tribe for some reason? Probably not. Probably Edom is representative. It's supposed to point to any act of violence against the creation, against the stability and order that God has created. And I think it's really important that we look, at verse, verse 3. I have trodden the winepress alone. And so the reminder again that this is God's job. Nobody else gets to judge. Nobody else gets to participate in reestablishing justice and righteousness. It's not my position to take on the role of God. So like Steve, you said, you said that some psychopath could use this to justify their acts of violence. If you read this correctly, it can't. because this is God's job. God alone is the one who takes vengeance. And
See,
does
that's not
God,
what mine sounds like.
what's that?
Mine doesn't sound like that.
No.
It says,
What,
I've
do
been
you know,
putting the
what
wine press
translation do you
alone.
have?
I'm reading, what is it called? It's called the Bible. It's the Peterson Bible.
Oh, the Message?
Yeah, the Message Remix. So it sounds like he's upset that there's nobody else helping him in mine. It
Hmm.
really, I mean, I've been treading the wine press alone. No one was there to help me. Angrily, I stomped the grapes. Raging, I trampled the people. Their blood spurted all over me. All my clothes were soaked with blood. I was set on vengeance. The time for redemption has arrived. I looked around for someone to help. No one. I couldn't believe it. Not one volunteer. So I went ahead and did it myself.
Hmm.
That kind of sounds like it's not just his job, it's just that there's nobody up to helping him.
Hmm.
He can't find anyone. It's kind of a different take.
Yeah, that is an interesting one. Yeah, so Peterson's Message is interesting, and I like it a lot. But it's a paraphrase of the Bible rather than a translation. So sometimes you have to be careful that, you know, we've talked in the past about how, of course, all translations of the Bible are interpretations, because you've got to decide which version, you know, which word you're going to use to translate, and how you're going to put the sentences together grammatically for the language that you're using. But Peterson then kind of takes it a second step further and tries to retool some of the images for modern readers so that they can understand it a little bit better, which means that he is making that call about, you know, what is this about? Is this about God reminding us that this is only God's job, or is this God getting upset with us because we're supposed to be there working too and we're not doing it? And he kind of,
So I made a note on the last one that you read, the last one. It's only God's job. God is in control, or we are the only hands God has. So it's just like those are those two different.
right.
So whatever. It's a
Yeah,
thought
so I think that kind
we
of
can
transitions us well
enrich our
into,
thought thinking.
yeah, no, I think that's a good transition, because I think, you know, the context for this passage is really important for helping us understand the role of violence here. It's easy for us, I think, as people that, you know, generally are secure, generally are safe. I mean, we've got some crazy stuff going on politically right now. We've got the pandemic going on, but generally speaking, we are not in a position to understand where Israel is at this point, and the messages that of comfort that they need to receive. You know, this passage comes from a larger set of chapters that are lament. They're complaining to God because God has not come as a warrior to defeat Israel's enemies. They are in exile. They are powerless. They're fearful. They want God to act. They want God to come in, sweep through, and destroy all the enemies and reestablish them as the power in the region. But they don't get that vengeance. God doesn't act. Why aren't you acting? And so this passage, you know, could kind of be a description of what it is that the Israelites want from God. They desire a strong, capable defender who is frenzied with anger over how these people are being treated. They want their knight in shining armor to come swooping in and save them from the dragon. But it's not happening. And
It's not happening again either.
why is that? And is it wrong to have that desire? When you're being oppressed, when you've got an enemy to look at and say, this is the reason why this is happening to me, is it wrong to say to God, hey, why aren't you here destroying this person or this group or this situation? Why aren't you fixing this? We know that you can. We know that you have the power to do it. Aren't you angry watching this happen to us? Don't you feel fury in the way that, You know, a parent would feel fury if they saw their child being bullied and want to go over and smack those kids around a little bit. Why aren't you doing that?
Does that take us back to your first statement about how God loved the Egyptians too?
And so I think we have to wrestle with that we have these questions, why is God allowing all these people to die from this pandemic? Why is God allowing all these people to die in the street? Regardless of their political persuasion. Why are we fighting each other like this? Why is the world like this? Why does God allow this to happen? And I think that takes us back to the Noah. It's like this, or God could just destroy everything and then there would be nothing. Which would we prefer? Would we prefer to live and wrestle through this and work through it and struggle and, have moments of clarity about God and ourselves, but also have to suffer through all this pain and watching our fellow humans hurt each other and beat each other up constantly and all the selfishness and greed that's around us? Can we make a difference in the small ways if we continue to maintain our connection to God and attempting to establish those correct relationships with one another? Is this the best of all possible worlds? If you want to ask Candide, we don't know. So I don't think this passage answers anything for us, but I think it's about why, and we're always remembering the why. Why is God acting in this way, or why is God portrayed in this way? And again, in this particular situation, it's first because God is the only one who can establish justice and righteousness, and second, it's not something to be celebrated when God does exact vengeance, because God loves those people too, and God judges for the purpose of restoring those relationships, not for the purpose of eternal punishment and things like that. God loves the Egyptians too.
He doesn't want eternal punishment because he sent his son. He sacrificed his son to save us, to bring us back to him.
Mm-hmm.
So if he wanted eternal punishment, then he would have just not bothered.
Yep.
Good point.
All right, well, let's circle back and wrap it up here for today. I would like to go back just a little bit before Exodus 15 and look at Exodus 14, verses 13 through 14.
Exodus 14.
Chapter 14. And since everybody already had a turn, I can read this one. So we're going to just read chapter 14, verses 13 through 14. And this is in the context of they're all, standing on the edge of the sea, and the Egyptians are coming after them, and they say, "Why did you bring us out here to die? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians in Egypt than to die in the wilderness." And then it says, "But Moses said to the people, 'Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you only have to keep still.'"
That's the problem. We don't want to keep still and be patient. We want it to happen now.
Yep. So we come back around to, what we saw in the other passage, "Be still and know that I am God." But it describes what is our role in God and what God does to deliver and restore the creation. It is nothing. We have no role. If we want to maintain our place, if we want to be where we're supposed to be in the good created order, then our job is to keep still.
Are we going to explore what that means next week?
I think we'll continue to look at it, certainly. I don't think it's specifically that, but yeah, we can definitely keep that one in mind. I think there's there's a challenge with this because we've got this God as warrior motif. We've got this sense that the Lord will fight for you. But then we've also got places where it reminds us that it's our job to do these things, that God has chosen to work through us. And so to go too far into the keep still, don't do anything, don't act at all, is to shirk our call, to ignore the duties that God has given to us. But to try to act either on our own behalf or on even in behalf of others to such a degree that we are kind of stepping out of our place, forgetting that it's God's job, God's plan, and not our own, then that also is doing violence, like we talked about with Karen. So
There's a lot to
I think
discuss.
it's kind of keep the why in mind. If you are acting because of your own desires, for your own outcomes, for selfishness and your own control over your own life and what's going on around you, then you're probably in the wrong, because in those moments you are to keep still and know that I am God. But we also have to remember that evil is real, violence is real. We as humans are by nature the perpetrators of the violence, and so we have to be vigilant against our own penchant for violence. But we also have to remember that God is powerful enough to defeat it in us and in the world. And so we can hold comfort and hope in that idea that God is there for us, God is with us. And so also, remember that these images of God as the warrior are difficult for us as fairly comfortable, fairly stable people to swallow, but they are of deep comfort to those who are oppressed, for those for whom there is no justice in the world. But again, we have to remember that if we put our hope in God, if we remember that God is for us, that does not mean that God is against our enemies. That does not mean that God isn't. God is ours to manipulate and send it against our enemies, and God isn't we can't create God in our image. We are created in God's image, and so there will be times that perhaps God will appear as a warrior against us if we get wrapped up in injustice and disobedience and violence. God will correct us. God will judge us. God will work to restore us in the ways that God the ways that God works and acts in the world. So it's not that God is for us because, in the way that we understand it in the world, God is for everyone. God is with everyone, even those we consider our enemies. And so how do we continue to wrestle with that? How do we find comfort in the face of our oppressions and in the face of our oppressors, while at the same time understanding that God is on the side of our oppressors just as much as God is on our side? Just in this particular moment, of course, God is not happy with and is going to be judging and correcting and restoring, hopefully, that oppressive behavior. And it's about that reestablishment, about restoration. God is not in the business of retribution. God is not there to punish. God is there to restore, to rehabilitate, to bring back, to reestablish the right relationships and the right order in the world. And so we have to be in that place too, which again is really hard. It's against our human nature. It's against our inclination. We want that person that hurt us to get theirs, and we want to get what we deserve, which is of course good things. So we have to hold all of these different things in tension as we try to navigate what all this means for us. So that's all I have for today. Any comments, questions, closing thoughts, disagreements?
You gave us some real violence today.
Finally, right? Get some blood-soaked robes going on.
And drowning all these guys in the sea.
Yeah, yeah.
The whole Pharaoh was not thinking,
No, that's for sure.
because now he has no army. So the Egyptians are open to anyone who wants to walk in and take them over.
This is true.
Lots to think about.
We'll bring some new excitement.
All right. Well, I will leave you to your thinking, and I certainly would love to hear some of what you come up with next week. I don't know what we'll get into next week yet. I have to take a look at it and see what we want to look at next. Probably something to do with, we'll get into the 10 Commandments and some of that violence against groups of people that kind of seems unfair to me. But I'll think about how we can wrestle with that a little bit.
Very good. Thank
All
you,
right.
Kate.
Well, thank you all
Wrestling.
for another good conversation.
Okay.
We'll be back again next week.
Okie doke.
Bye-bye.
Great.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.